Hello and welcome to the Thursday, September 11th, 2025 edition of the SANS Internet Storm Center's Stormcast. My name is Johannes Ulrich, recording today from Jacksonville, Florida. And this episode is brought to you by the SANS.edu Graduate Certificate Program in Penetration Testing and Ethical Hacking. Well, today's diary was inspired by a story I covered last week about a botnet that used DNS for remote command and control, but encoded the commands using BASE64. Didier today noticed, BASE64 actually contains a couple characters like the slash and the equal symbol that must not show up in DNS hostnames. So how did they actually do it? Well, it turns out as so often that sometimes things that aren't supposed to work still work under certain circumstances. And what Didier found out is that, for example, NS lookup, if some of these odd characters are being returned, well, it works just fine with NS lookup. This is actually an important lesson that I often cover when I'm talking about web application security, that you can't really trust that protocols like DNS only return valid content. I think it was a few years ago I've written about this, and maybe I have to write about it again because not sure where it ended up. But for example, it is certainly possible to do things like SQL injection and cross-site scripting over DNS. If you're not careful in cleaning up and validating responses you're getting back via DNS, very famously Whois, of course. Now that's just plain text. There are a number of Whois entries that have existed in the past with exploits in them. And yes, whenever you get any content back from external systems, you have to make sure that their content actually matches the structure that you are expecting. Well, we have a little bit Patch Tuesday cleanup to do, and that's usually about, patches that were released yesterday that we just didn't cover because of all the patches released by Microsoft and a couple others. First one I want to cover here is Google Chrome released an update fixing two security vulnerabilities, one of them being critical, and that's a use after free in service worker. So definitely potential here for remote code execution. So definitely update, but Google Chrome, as I often say, is pretty good about updating itself. Make sure you restart Google Chrome once a day. And then we got patches from Ivanti fixing a number of different products, essentially an entire sort of remote access style suite that they have, which includes Connect Secure, Ivanti Policy Secure, CTA Gateway, Neurons for secure access. So a number of different but similar somewhat products. The first vulnerability here, they call it missing authorization and then describe it as allowing a remote authenticated hacker to hijack existing HTML5 connections. I believe they're talking here about WebSocket connections. There have been similar vulnerabilities before, and they have been exploited. So there are templates essentially available how to exploit these type of vulnerabilities, which makes it more likely that they actually will be exploited in the future. The second vulnerability here is a cross-site request forgery vulnerability in the same set of products. This particular one does allow a remote unauthenticated hacker to execute sensitive actions. So the way a cross-site request forgery attack usually works is that a logged-in victim, while they're still logged in, is visiting a site that the attacker controls, and then the attacker can essentially sort of remote control the browser and performing actions on behalf of the victim. So these would be more targeted attacks. They're less likely going to be sort of widespread and sort of a big number of victim attacks. As a good measure, of course, logging out of sites is always a good thing. But we're talking here about the secure access products where users legitimately may be logged in pretty much all day in order to interact with internal systems and such. And that logging out is not necessarily a valid countermeasure in this particular case. So patch, apply the updates, and hopefully, we won't see an exploit for any of these vulnerabilities too soon. And then we got Sophos releasing new firmware for its access points, the AP6 series. Well, fixing an authentication bypass vulnerability that they're considering critical. Definitely update. Not a lot of detail available yet about what the exact authentication bypass vulnerability is all about in these access points. And then, also some good news from a defensive point of view. Yesterday, Apple, of course, released a lot of new hardware and such, but what they didn't mention that this also included a new security feature that's supported by this new hardware. They published this blog post to explain a little bit what's happening here. They call it memory integrity enforcement. And essentially what it does is it allows hardware and software to work together to make things like buffer overflows and memory allocation issues less likely to happen and to be exploitable. Looks interesting. It's also based on some prior work from others like, I believe, Google and such that have proposed similar things. They now made it work in their, again, latest hardware. It's not going to really affect any older devices. However, they already introduced some new constructs here, new APIs and such, to basically make it easier to write memory safe code in Apple devices in general. And overall, what they're trying to fight here is somewhat of the high-end nation-state-like spyware and such that we often have seen infect particular mobile devices. So that's really what they're going after here. Well, and that's it for today. Thanks for listening. Thanks for subscribing. Thanks for recommending this podcast. And that's it. Thanks, and talk to you again tomorrow. Bye.